and welcome back to MMO-Play's Top List, a new segment where we'll be covering the best of the best in the MMO world. For this video, we'll be talking about the top 10 biggest MMORPG failures. So without further ado, let's get to it. To start off the list at number 10, we have one of my biggest letdowns and failures, Ragnarok Online 2. Being an RO player myself, I was pretty stoked to hear of a sequel. When someone thinks of RO, you think of 2D sprites running around in a 3D world. Instead, we got brightly, childlike, chipified graphics and characters that made the game feel like just another average 3D MMO. On top of that, instead of disappearing, the trees block your view to a point where you have to zoom in to see what's going on. Gravity was able to launch the game without a slew of bugs, but instead we got horrible translations and a fully loaded cache shop ready for milking. At number 9, we have probably one of the most short-lived MMOs ever, Allpoints Bulletin. Developed by Real Time Worlds, APB aimed to be the best GTA-style MMO. Instead, it shut down less than 3 months after launch. Developers claimed that the game failed due to a lack of PvE. Yeah, that's right. They said there was too much PvP. Players, on the other hand, complained about the slew of aimbotters and cheaters that plagued the servers. It really didn't help that reviews were not allowed to be published before the game's release, meaning that if you wanted to try it, you were going to have to buy it. And to top it all off, after the game shut down in September, none of the players were issued refunds. At number 8, we've got Star Trek Online. Star Trek Online ultimately failed thanks to its poor PvP system. Even the developers at Cryptic admitted that there was a serious problem with the game's PvP. It failed to provide successful ground and space combat. Even if you could look past the combat, the game becomes super repetitive in storyline, graphics, and even environments. That, coupled with a lack of content updates, or better yet, unfinished ones. Remember the Klingon faction release? There was literally no mission quest at all. Overall, the game is just a pretty big letdown. For number 7, we have Matrix Online. The game was developed by Monolith Productions, but shortly after its release was bought out by Sony Online Entertainment. Selling the Matrix Online really hurt the game's development. The game itself was already plagued with bugs, especially missions. NPCs would glitch out on rescues and refuse to follow. Or, better yet, sometimes the NPCs would randomly one-shot players for no reason. The missions that did work were repetitive, and the game overall just lacked content. The combat consisted of buggy, turn-based hand-to-hand attacks. SOE ended up overhauling combat, but the game was already gone by then. On top of that, main characters from the movies were completely phased out from the storylines, and then replaced with characters that players weren't familiar with and couldn't relate to. At number 6, we have Hellgate London, which turned out to be one big hell of a mess. Hellgate was supposed to be a really cool demonic-themed RPG from Flagship Studios. The problem with the game was that it was extremely overhyped, which led to some huge letdowns after launch. Flagship Studios tried to conquer way too much at one time. Hellgate London was their first 3D game, first FPS, first subscription-based game, and they planned to release the game worldwide in 17 different languages. The game was a single-player co-op action RPG with no persistent world or MMO traits, yet they still tried to charge a sub fee. If players unsubbed to the game, they would lose all their content updates they paid for, access to certain areas, and even characters that were created beyond the core of the game. The game might not have been that bad if it wasn't for the subscription. And coming in at number 5, marking the halfway point on our top list of failures, comes Age of Conan. Developed by Funcom, Age of Conan was supposed to be the next best thing to hit the market. Instead, players got a game that was fun for the first 20 levels, and then after that, there was no in-game content. It was just boring. The game just wasn't ready for release, but it did one of the biggest no-nos and released early in an attempt to thwart Warhammer Online's launch. The game had found a niche mature market featuring nudity and foul language, but the overall rushed work led to its demise. The game has improved over the years since the release, but due to the rocky start, it will probably never reach the potential of what it could have been. Drifting into number 4, we have Autosol. This game was supposed to be a great game. The idea behind it was players could drive around in an apocalyptic world killing people with the ultimate death car. But it turned out to be more like a third-person shooter instead of an RPG. The problem with driving around a barren apocalyptic world is, well, it's bare. And when you did find something to do, it was easily soloed, so there was never a reason for anyone to group up. Developers even started referring to it as a massively single player instead of an MMO. All players had to do was drive around plowing down thousands of enemies at a time. The boring and bare world ultimately led to the game's shutdown 1 year later. To try to make amends for their failure, NCSoft offered players special perks for their next big release, Tabula Rasa. Coming in at number 3, we have Star Wars Galaxy, a game that had potential and completely threw it all away. Star Wars Galaxy started out as a pretty okay game. It wasn't great, but it wasn't horrible. It was a Star Wars game, but there wasn't enough Star Wars. It just didn't give players that experience they wanted. Combat wasn't very good, and space combat was just boring. And to top it off, the developers at Sony Online Entertainment didn't listen to player feedback and instead just kept trying to reinvent the game with drastic changes, which ultimately led to the game's demise. And yes, I'm referring to the new game experience, a huge update that completely changed the fundamentals of the game. It could have been a good thing if it didn't come loaded with major bugs and inconsistencies. And at number 2, we have Tabula Rasa, a game that was supposed to make up for Autosol, but instead ended up being Richard Garriott's biggest embarrassment. Tabula Rasa earns the 2nd spot because there isn't a good reason as to why it should have even failed. The game was in development for 6 years, yet at its release, it was completely bugged out and unplayable. The server lagged so much because it couldn't handle the large numbers of NPCs placed on a single map. It got so bad that players couldn't even enter certain zones because of it. And when a zone did load, players spent half their time knocked down because pretty much every enemy came with a CC or knockback called Bane Kick. And to top it off, the UI seemed unfinished. There was no customizations and it was missing keyboard shortcuts. Players ultimately felt like they were fighting against the interface instead of using it to help them. And now it's about time we get to number 1, but first let's recap on all the games we have this far. At number 10, we have Ragnarok Online 2. At number 9, Allpoints Bulletin. Number 8, Star Trek Online. Number 7, Matrix Online. Number 6, Hellgate London. Number 5, Age of Conan. Number 4, Auto Assault. Number 3, Star Wars Galaxies. And number 2, Tabula Rasa. And finally, the award for the biggest failure in MMO history goes to Vanguard Saga of Heroes. Now, I realize the game has cleaned up its act after the disaster that was Vanguard Saga of Heroes 7 years ago, but let's face it, it was still a big disaster. The game was developed by Sigil Games, but was rushed to release, so the launch ended up being a complete fail. The game had been hyped as one of the most hardcore MMOs out there, but didn't even come with the box features like flying mounts or fellowships. The client would constantly crash to desktop when attempting to play it, and when players could get in, the game was missing content and actual graphics. Just imagine paying a subscription and box fee for a game, and then going to turn in a quest and the NPC is missing, or the end quest is broken. To top it off, pretty much the entire staff was fired in the parking lot shortly after launch. SOE did pick it up and has managed to pull it out of the rubble, but because of what happened, the game will never be as good as what it could have been. And there you have it, the top 10 biggest failures. If there's a game you think deserves a spot, make sure to let us know why in the comments below. And as always, thank you guys for watching. Don't forget to subscribe or shoot us a follow or like on Facebook and Twitter.